minutes, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this really important and very timely hearing. I want to first say that, we've heard a lot about violent crime and smash and grabs, and we, of course, all condemn that. I just wish we heard the same enthusiasm about the importance of prosecuting the smash and grabs and the violence that occurred on January 6th. We're also hearing lots of concern from our Republican colleagues about conditions for those in confinement. That's welcome news. There are many of us who have been worried about that, particularly for communities of color for a very long time. It's good to have some of our Republican colleagues now so concerned about that, and we welcome their newfound enthusiasm or interest in this area. The suggestion, though, that this compassionate release or early home confinement is releasing criminals into the community. The Bureau of Prisons director testified in the Senate in April that 24,000 people were transferred to home confinement and only 3 were arrested for new crimes. So these individuals, by and large, reintegrated into the community successfully. So what I want to focus on is what the purpose of this hearing is, and that is the effect of this pandemic on incarcerated individuals. We get to make decisions to mitigate the risk of COVID by vaccinating ourselves, wearing protective masks, staying 6 feet away from each other, getting tested. Those same practices are not available very often to those who are incarcerated. And so while I welcome the news of the Attorney General Garland to reverse the Trump era legal opinion that the Bureau of Prisons now has the option to allow inmates to remain on home confinement to avoid risk of COVID, Dr. Vendors, I want to ask you, what should the Bureau of Prisons be doing today to reduce the spread of COVID-19 or the other strains, and also in their treatment of individuals who test positive?
I think one of the most pressing issues is to find and protect people who are high risk. Omicron particularly moves so quickly through facilities, these congregate settings. All these places know or have the capacity to know who's high risk, that who either is unvaccinated or meets the CDC criteria for having higher risk of illness or death. We need to protect those people, and it means that we prioritize them for vaccination. We don't just offer a whole housing area vaccination, take it or leave it. We find those high risk people, we talk to them, engage with them, because they have lots and lots of questions about the vaccine, legitimate questions. Every one of those people vaccinated is a potential life saved. Then when COVID, if and when it hits, when people are in quarantine because they've been exposed, we need to find those high-risk people every day and check on them for symptoms. The CDC has said, let's do this for everybody since the outset of the pandemic. When I get into facilities, I find nobody's actually asking people about new symptoms of COVID during quarantine. And those high-risk folks, we can save their lives if we find their symptoms early. And then finally, when they get into medical isolation, if and when they have COVID themselves, we need to have a lower threshold for sending them to the hospital or just having a nurse call a doctor if it's a high-risk person. So a pulse rate of 92 in a person with diabetes or who's 85 or both is probably more concerning than a pulse rate of 105 in a young, healthy person. And so we need to think about that.
I want to try to get in one more question. So I thank you for that. And Ms. Gersony, thank you for all of the work that you have done. You have concluded that 280 people have died from COVID-19 in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And your research has shown that of the 260 deaths that you were able to track, just 70 had filed a motion for compassionate release with the federal courts, and 3 of those motions were granted. So based on your research, is the Bureau of Prisons compassionate release process being adequately utilized for individuals suffering from COVID-19 or at risk of COVID-19? What should the BOP be doing better to address that? And finally, I have a piece of legislation that will also allow the court to grant compassionate release directly. Would that be helpful in this context as well?
Yeah, so those 3 people whose motions were granted, those are just the 3 motions that were granted of people who ultimately died. We know that federal courts have granted around 3,000 compassionate release motions generally, and those are 3,000 people who certainly wouldn't have died in Bureau of Prisons custody because they had been released. So I do think that looking at just those 3 motions isn't accurate, and we know at least of the 297 people that have died, and at least 297 people that have died in Bureau of Prisons custody who have petitioned for compassionate release or asked the court for relief, we can't actually identify what they've done in the Bureau of Prisons because the Bureau of Prisons doesn't provide that data. And so it's very difficult to judge from the data that we have for the federal courts what's truly happening in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. So I think, again, getting that data. Now, again, a piece of legislation that allows people to petition directly to the courts would be a step forward, but I also think it's imperfect just because of the discretion vested with the federal judiciary and compassion fatigue.
Thank you. And Madam Chair, before I yield back, I just want to acknowledge the extraordinary testimony of Ms. Levy and thank you for sharing your story and the powerful words you gave to this committee. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Ciccilline. Your time has expired. Has come on. Thank you, Mr. Ciccilline. Do you have any